box there?
Yep.
Got it.
It's a little key.
I guess that means I should zoom my content a little bit there. Okay. All right, so I want to talk about web hosting and what are the different options and what are people doing and what works. What's the Etherpad?
Web hosts. All over.
Like that? Okay, let's see if that works. Hey, look at that. Cool. The like very personal use case that has brought this as an important thing for me is that my web host announced that they're shutting down and they're not transferring to anything. So they like giving us tips on how to transfer, but like no one's buying their hosted accounts or anything. And so it's all up to everyone that's on that system to transfer. I think I have like less than 2 weeks. So I have to like transfer it. And
How many 2 weeks?
What's that?
How many weeks did they give you?
4 weeks.
4 weeks.
Yeah.
Well, what is the name of the house?
Empowering Media. Yeah.
Is it like a local house?
I think they used to be like mid-sized, and they just didn't care to like try to keep up with the market, and so they got like people leaving for like
Everything.
either on the high end to things like AWS or Linode, and on the low end to things like Squarespace and Wix, depending on like what people were wanting. And so there's this almost like hollowing out of the market of web hosts that seems to be going on. That's like fewer and fewer sort of like hobbyist level hosting provider options, but there's still plenty. But in case this should happen to someone else in the future, I'd be like, it's good to document, like, well, what do you go through? How do you pick a new web host and all that? And the broader context of that is like when folks try to get started on the IndieWeb, there's kind of, there's basically like 2 or 3 different paths you can take. And the one is that you can immediately get on like a service, like a kind of full service like micro.blog or Blogger or WordPress.com. Like you're not even worrying about a web host. You're just like, I'm going to go sign up on this service. They'll let me map my domain name. I'm all set. They handle all that stuff for you. Or you pick a CMS and you pick like a hosting provider. And so this is what we have right now, based on some tutorials that people have written up and some to be written, just for AWS and Reclaim hosting so far. So depending on like what level you want, some tutorials. And that's really about it. Now the challenge here is that I don't actually know if I want to do either of those. So I don't even see like another link to a web host here. Let's see, maybe that's down below. Here we go. Yeah, so that's web. So, but if, once you dive into web hosting, there's like, well, what are your needs? Like, what are the what are your questions that you have? Again, we try to like direct people. Hey, like, are you sure you run a web host? Maybe you just want something simple. And then if you have a specific CMS and that's what you want to stick with, then here's some easier solutions for that too, where they kind of handle the setup of that. But if you're like me and you have a custom setup, then you actually want like something, like I can't do static domain hosting because I'm using PHP, where I need some sort of shared hosting. And so down here, yeah, there we go. That's the one I'm on right now. That'll be dropping, so I should probably edit this page. DreamHost, these are a bunch that people have some experience with, and I'm wondering, just in general here, like who's using what kind of hosting service? Like who's using a web host at all to like host their stuff?
What is a web host?
What is a web host?
Yeah.
I'd say it's like the simplest definition would be like a service provider. You're paying them money, and they give you some space to put stuff on the web.
What if you're not paying them enough?
Like 50 megabytes or whatever?
Who knows? Like some of them are like, here's a gigabyte. Some of them are like GitHub.
So
Where?
how much your provider? How much was it given you?
What's that?
How much was this provider and if you're willing from how much was it?
I think they all have like different levels too. Typically, like this much money for this much storage, this much money for this much storage. GitHub is sort of a host. It's a static host. Like you can't run anything on GitHub. It's a subset of the web hosts. But usually when people say web hosting, they mean something you can run some sort of programming language like on the back end, whether it's PHP or Python or Node or Ruby, whatever stack you're using. So there's DreamHost and Reclaim Hosting. I've both heard good things about from folks in the community. My web host, which is Empowering Media, the one that's shutting down, is recommending one called Bluehost. And I'm curious if anyone has heard anything about Bluehost or had any experience with it.
I think it's pretty popular. I think I've heard of it.
It's pretty popular?
Yeah.
Do you know like what kind of circles of web?
I think it's like, it's almost as popular as Dreamhost.
That should probably maybe go in a different section. That's fine. Just so we document like.
I've been using dedicated servers from Europe. It's like much cheaper. I basically pay the same price that I would be paying for a light node, and I have like the whole server to myself.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's
like
the.
12 gigs of RAM for the same price that like I would be just having like 2 gigs of RAM and a shared 2 gig of RAM.
Do you update? Are you responsible for updating the OS and like the languages and all that since it's a dedicated server?
Yeah.
Okay. So like the use case I have is I don't actually want to be a server admin per se. Like I don't want to worry about the version of PHP or the operating system or the like what version of Apache or like updating all of those. Like that's like if you want full control of a box, then you also sign up for the responsibility of the full control of a box. And I kind of want the web host to handle that for me. And that's.
I think it's relatively easy to do that nowadays. You just kind of like run the apt-get upgrade or update or whatever.
Yeah, I've yet to see.
How easy it is.
I think
It
some
is.
people, I think some people have managed to just put it like in the cron job and just like have it run automatically. I mean, if things break, I mean, if someone else is running it for you, things can break as well. Like when I was using the.
But you can open a support ticket. So if someone else is running it for you,
Yeah.
the answer, like, and it breaks, the answer isn't go fix it. The answer is you open a support ticket, and because you're paying them money, they're responsive and they fix it for you.
Right, yeah.
With different SLAs.
It usually takes me longer to do the support ticket than to fix it myself.
That's you.
Yeah. I'd certainly say that's certainly not me. Like, for any of the problems I've had to file support tickets for, it's always been something where it would have taken me a lot longer than it took them. Yeah.
So I've been using WebFaction, and I've been very happy with them until a few weeks ago when they got bought out by GoDaddy. A lot of people I know on WebFaction are wondering about whether we're going to have to migrate.
Okay.
Just because they don't want to deal with GoDaddy.
I mean, so that's another reason why you might want to migrate is someone gets acquired by another company that, for whatever reason, you might not want to do business with. You know, like full disclosure, GoDaddy has sponsored some IndieWebCamps in the past as well. So there's at least like different groups inside GoDaddy that like some of them are very IndieWeb friendly, and others maybe I don't know. People have had different experiences with them too, but. Like whatever your preference is, like it's like your site, so you should have the freedom to move it. So that's another good example of like why you might want to move. So let's see, it's like
Well, in case anyone from GoDaddy is listening, if you don't mess with WebFaction, you'll make a lot of people happy.
Do you want to ask me?
Yeah.
Well, I just what's your stack, and do you have an idea of what it would take to move it somewhere else? And maybe a follow-on question is really just like, is there a place that like just has a list of the different IndieWeb stacks, and then what are the right providers for those stacks or whatever, or something, or at least it just provides enough information for the community to start filling it out.
yeah. So for me, the only things I'm dependent on are, well, so I have like a bunch of static files, and like obviously, and PHP. So I've tried to minimize my dependencies to those two. Oh, and I should say HT access. So by that, it's like Apache As in, like, my htaccess does stuff that I need to do. Apache, or I think the one that's Lightspeed HTTP.
There's a hoster called nearlyfreespeech.net.
A what called?
Nearlyfreespeech.net.
Are they?
I've heard of that. Somebody from, I think it was Paul from like IndieWebCamp 2015 used it.
Yeah, so it's pretty popular. They basically, it's kind of like a, you can basically pay them like 25 cents a month if you want to use like the least kind of like powerful tier, or if you want to have like more kind of like power. You basically pay for like each individual thing that you use. So if you want to use DNS with them, then you pay something like $1 a year or something like that for DNS. And then if you want to have like PHP or whatnot, then you pay like some other price. So it's pretty popular in some circles. For example, there's the guy who wrote the Erlang book, Learn with some Erlang. He actually uses it, so he hosts the Learn with some Erlang book on the nearlyfreespeech.net. So I think it's been around for like a very long time.
Does anyone here use it? Okay.
So I think it's been around for like a very long time. So if you want something that's
Yeah.
secure, then I think it's a pretty good. Yeah, since 2007.
So I think
So Learn with some Erlang is like one of the most
Yeah.
popular like users of it.
there's an article linked on the wiki from 2012 where it's 5 best web hosting companies.
Which I would feel like that's pretty old at this point, right? Like,
So I think there's like a methodology problem here, which is
okay.
You have an immediate need, which is you need to move your website to
Yeah.
a thing. There are plenty of options. Like there are
Almost too many.
almost too many options, but it's also hard to find what are the options, because you need to, and I think you're in a good position where you're listing out your criteria. You need to be able to host static files, you need PHP, you need htaccess.
Yeah.
So I think the first step of like, when you need to move your site is list out what you are dependent on first.
Yeah.
Because like, that is a different list than me.
Right.
I have a very different list of criteria of what I need, because I have a database, for example. It's a cache of my for building indexes, but I need a database on whatever my hosting solution is. And that'd be the same for WordPress, right? Where, so I think this, like, we can list out web hosts all day long, but that's not terribly interesting. I think the
Well, I didn't want to like
interesting
do the list all the web hosts. Like, I wanted to actually talk about what people are using,
Right.
because to me that's real world as opposed to secondhand hearsay.
Yeah.
Like, I'm less interested in that because like we can all do Google searches to find that out.
But I also think that it's useful to know why people are using something and like what features they actually use of it.
Yeah.
So, and then yeah, like I've moved websites to different servers and different web hosts quite a lot. So like I have a process that I use now to do this, where if I know I need to move a site, I actually just moved a bunch of the IndieWeb stuff over to a new server. So like I have my own process for evaluating something, choosing something, and then doing the actual migration.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what you're getting at here, which is how do you know how to do it when you've just been like, using one thing for a long time?
Well, I also want to answer it for the getting started use case. Like, I feel like this is a really important aspect of someone shows up at the IndieWeb, whatever that means to them, like, oh, I want IndieWeb. And they maybe like have some programming development experience. They want to get their hands dirty too, right? They want a domain name. They want to get a web host because they want to actually tinker with stuff more than just depending on the service. Because I feel like those are very different use cases. Someone wants to get on the IndieWeb and just use it, great. I think that like sending people to micro.blog or WordPress.com is a great way to get them up and running. And maybe some of those folks decide, I have some experience now, I want to build something, or I want to hack on my own fork of WordPress or whatever. It's those folks that like that, there's that methodology of like, how do you make the initial decision of like, well, what should I go use? What web host should I go use? And then the migration one is related, but not the same.
And And I think an important thing of considering which web host to use is also answering the question, how do I move it if I need to? So that you're not getting yourself stuck in something unintentionally.
Is anyone working on a standard? I know WordPress has a really, at least I like their import and export. Is anyone working on kind of a generic or kind of open standard for doing that for blogging?
That is kind of a different problem because that's migrating software, not migrating web hosts.
Well, and the reason I thought of it is because it becomes, potentially if it's an open standard, then it's agnostic to software.
If it's implemented.
Yeah.
Yeah. As far as I know, there's nothing like that right now. Like everyone, WordPress has an export.
People have built tools that read and write the WordPress format because it's WordPress and because they're sort of literally. But I haven't heard a lot of success stories around that.
In fact, we just heard during the intro someone lost their categories. Who was that?
Anton.
Manton.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, so I have an organization that I work with, in Los America's local film festival. They're about 21 years old, and I've been maintaining their sites since they were on Dreamweaver. So we have archive sites in Dreamweaver, we have archive sites in Joomla, and then we have WordPress. And we're actually working on migrating them all over.
wow.
Which I think is probably maybe still different from hosting, but one of the challenges is when you get that old and when you've seen technology age and die, you also have to think about that and getting it hosted and selecting. I have some sites from the late 90s that are archived, and I still find it's great to post it someday.
So who here uses like a dedicated machine hosting?
Like where you get real access to a server.
Yeah, where it's like your server and like.
I use several.
Okay. So I think that's probably worth capturing as like.
It's, I mean, I don't have a dedicated server. It's a virtual private server, but I get full machine access, like root access to the machine. It's not like my own hardware, but it is, I would put it in that category still. Like, I am responsible for operating system upgrades.
Yep. Okay, and then how many people use, what would you call the other kind? Shared hosting?
Usually shared hosting, yeah.
That's what we call it, it's just shared hosting.
I use DreamHost
I
Share.
also do shared hosting.
You also do that, okay. So maybe we should,
The costing that we're talking about, that's the shared cost, isn't it?
Yeah, shared hosting.
so DreamHost, was that you, Gregor, that said that?
Yeah.
I also use DreamHost.
And what have your experiences with it been? Like, good, fair?
Good.
I'm not very good.
The reason I use it is because I use it for software that I know I don't really want to deal with the dependencies of it, that I know will work on it. So like WordPress is a perfect example. Like WordPress has done a good job of making their software run on a lot of platforms, so I know it'll run fine on shared hosting. And I also don't want that on my main server because it's more likely to get hacked than other software. And if it gets hacked, I want it in their isolated environment where they're dealing with it.
They've also done quite a bit of work on their own to make their WordPress itself more secure. I think I've been with them probably close to a decade now, and yeah, I've been pretty happy with them. They have less encrypt now. They're basically air quotes unlimited, so like they don't charge you for bandwidth and storage, unless you get crazy.
And storage, you said?
Yeah.
Okay.
And domains and unlimited email forwards.
Do they have a way to import or export email forwards?
I don't know.
They do give you a website interface where you can see just copy and paste one giant thing of all your from and to addresses for forwarding.
Huh.
So you can go and just like copy out all of your forwarding rules very quickly. And it's just text, it's just from and to on a line.
But can you import into
You
them?
can then paste into that.
Oh,
And
wow.
it'll recreate all the rules, yeah.
In a text field?
Yeah, it's just like a text area on a web page. I actually used that when I shut down my email server. I used to do all my own email, and I migrated my email over to DreamHost. And I had all my own forwarding rules that I exported as text, and I just pasted it into that field, and they created them all.
Where did you migrate
From
from to?
my own SMTP server I was running on a machine. And it was like, I had all the rules set up in a database, and I didn't want to deal with email anymore. So I moved it over to DreamHost.
Has anyone like had experience with like filing issues with their web host, and what has that experience been like? Like, what problems have you experienced? Then you file an issue, then what happened?
I've had a couple with DreamHost. I'm forgetting what the issues were. They were pretty responsive, and I got an answer within like 10 hours. Usually a solution within 24.
That's good to know.
Another thing I like about them, you can configure the PHP version like per domain, and you can also set it to be like always use the latest. So if you always just want like their latest stable version, or you can pin it to a specific version.
Wow. That sounds potentially useful. Okay, I see Jack Jameson's, he uses Bluehost. That's good to know. But he's remote. I know there's a bunch of people in the community that use Reclaim hosting, but does anyone here use them? Okay. The other thing I know about both DreamHost is that they, well, I guess we already said they support Let's Encrypt there. Bluehost also does free HTTPS automatic with Let's Encrypt. I feel like that's something that any new host, or if you're especially you're choosing a host or choosing to switch to a host, should be an absolute like requirement. Like there's no reason for a new host today to not just give you HTTPS by default automatically. Like at worst a checkbox that just says turn it on. Oh yeah, someone brought up cPanel. Does anyone use or struggle with cPanel as their UI on their shared web host?
Definitely struggle.
Yeah.
Definitely struggled.
HostGator tried to come up with their own sort of theme on top of cPanel in hopes of making it easier, but it kind of became a hindrance, especially after using cPanel other places and expecting things in certain places.
My main confusion has been like cPanel usually works with WHM, Web Host Manager, and like sometimes the settings aren't where you think like, oh, I want this in cPanel, but it's in WHM.
What does WHM stand for again?
Web Host Manager. I think it's like the same company as cPanel, maybe it's different. I usually see that coming.
Yeah, part of my hope with documenting this is also making it as little work as possible for a new person. to experiment with their own domain in a web host, as opposed to someone who's like a dedicated tinkerer who wants to get into the whole like DevOps thing. Because I kind of feel like most people I've met are on like one side of the other of the fence, or they have like a specific compartment for one or the other. Like people are like either full on like I want to do all the DevOps myself because I want to be in control of it, or they're full on like I don't want to deal with any DevOps. Or maybe they have like one or two projects where like they want to do DevOps, and on everything else they don't. And so this is a good like way to, I feel like that's a good way to kind of direct people like, hey, which one of these is you, or which one are you looking for? In which case, like on the DevOps side, there's things like, what was the one that we mentioned earlier? The dedicated servers. I know someone mentioned Linode before.
Yeah, I use Linode for all
Okay.
This might be kind of beyond the scope, but what kind of recommendations do you have, if any, kind of making that leap from no DevOps to getting more involved in the DevOps? I think in my case, I get kind of confused and not sure of how to start having to deploy things, and I feel like that's something that keeps me from being able to use a lot of things that the IndieWeb community has created.
So I think when I'm looking, because I could do DevOps, stand it off and do it all, but do that from the data, something else. So one of the tipping points I always had was just shell access. So shell access and PHP when I have my database interface, because even if I don't want to touch it, sometimes I have to, so I can tell them faster what they did wrong. Or take out like the firewall as well. So, I mean, those two simple things, SSH access and MySQL, if you're on a learning curve, which I think is what you're asking about, at least that way you can also start looking at what it's doing. You always look before you touch.
So similarly, I would say even on a shared hosting plan, I had to do my own like robots blocking,
Right.
which is kind of DevOpsy, I feel like, because I had to do things like track down their IP addresses and like from my logs, and then write some HT access rules, and that has nothing to do with my CMS or posting on the IndieWeb, right? That has to do with like the internet, like the pipes, the tubes, the intertubes.
There
Yeah.
are little things that you might find yourself with, like blocking the admin, except for your IP and things like that. So it's super useful, but just having that one layer of access lets you start. And lets you make mistakes. That's what you have to do is make sure you have the backups.
I mean, honestly, I wouldn't mind if I could get out of the business of blocking bots and IPs, because I don't feel like that's the thing I want to spend my time on, or that I am an expert on. It's almost like I've only had to do that because of bandwidth limitations. Because
So there is a way to get out of the business, which is to put Cloudflare in front of your site, because that is exactly their business of making bandwidth not your problem and making bots not your problem.
So now we've added another relationship, though. So instead of managing bots, now you're managing your web host and you're managing Cloudflare,
Yeah.
like two configurations.
So I have a little bit of experience with Cloudflare. I've used it for a couple of things now, and I don't totally understand the right way to handle Cloudflare enough to put it in front of my actual site, because I'm not clear on how to deal with the caching rules around when I explicitly don't want stuff cached, like my admin interface, and when I'm logged in and things like that. And I just haven't had the time to go and dig into the right way to set it up. But I have set it up on sites that are like primarily static content. Not like literally static website, but just not changing content. And it is very easy for that. You basically give them control of your domain, and they deal with DNS on it. And then you tell it where to get the content from behind the scenes. And it mostly just works transparently after that.
Okay.
You never really notice it. I recently switched OAuth.net over to that. So now OAuth.net is served by Cloudflare, but the back end is the same host it was on before, and it was a pretty seamless transition.
Could that back end be GitHub
Yes.
if it's static?
Totally.
I mean,
Yeah.
We use Heroku plus GitHub for things when privacy is an issue. Or like access restrictions. You don't want to just be like public.
Oh.
so
Yeah, there's a whole other class of the sort of shared host model, which is Heroku, and things that are running on PHP.
So what class is that? Is it like app hosting?
They call themselves an app hoster.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
And then the apps because you are expected to be able to create an app and package your app enough to run in that
Yes.
environment. But then they give you a bunch of different languages that they can run. Which? I don't think they have a model like that, no, because with Linode you get a real server, and then you install an operating system on it, and you install.
So is
A website.
is App Engine, Google App Engine, an example of that?
Yes, yeah, App Engine, Heroku, there's a couple others I can't remember.
So, yeah, I guess, yeah, if you wanted.
Glitch?
Yeah.
Now, the big question I would ask here, like right away, is like, what's the portability of migration across these?
Not good.
That's why I wanted to ask.
Well, yeah, I guess it depends.
So, yes, the idea is that you write an app, and then in theory, anything that can run that language and framework, you could move it to. And with Heroku, that's like mostly true because mostly you're writing, like, if you write a Ruby app, run on Heroku, they're basically just running a Ruby app, and then you can just pick it up and run it somewhere else where you can run Ruby apps. The problem is there isn't anything that's exactly equivalent to Heroku, where you can literally just pick it up and move it with the same amount of effort. But you could, if you know how to run a Ruby environment on a VPS, it's very easy to move your app from Heroku to your own VPS. But then now you're responsible for the operating system, that kind of stuff. And then with Google App Engine, it's similar, but and it's especially once you're getting into like Amazon Web Services, the challenge is that they often give you more limited things and force you to build your app in a certain way that it depends on certain back-end things being there, which then tie you into that world more. And it becomes harder to just pick that up and move it somewhere else. And I mean, that's like kind of true with Heroku too, because like Heroku doesn't, you have to like add in their database thing and then configure out to use a database in a certain way, and you can't like write files onto the Heroku machine, you have to do file hosting a certain way. So you're kind of creating your application in a certain way that then can be run in these environments. There often aren't exact parallels by other vendors that you can just drop it into. Whereas like with PHP shared hosting, it's kind of the lowest common denominator. Everybody knows what a PHP shared host does, and you can pretty much just pick a thing up and drop it in. And as long as it is just depending on PHP, it'll probably work fine.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the lack of portability, or the lack of like, the barriers to portability have been what scared me away from app hosting. Like to even bother getting started with that. So I've similarly warned anyone new to not go down that path for that whole reason, because it feels like a trap. If you're a developer, like an experienced developer, and you're okay with like understanding those kinds of dependencies, then I think it's like a reasonable choice to put on the menu, as it were. But for anyone that's like, hey, I want to set up some simple PHP, MySQL, whatever, I feel like that app hosting is not really a good fit for those folks.
But that's actually like what their target market is.
Of course it is, because they want to take that they want to entrap that target market.
Right.
That's not good for us. So we're calling that out.
But I guess what you try to do is you take the lesson. So, I mean, I guess one of the things that organizations like Heroku try to push, I mean, there's the whole thing about the 12-factor app, where essentially you set your app up in a way in which there is no state like in the application. And so whatever infrastructure you use, whether it's a dedicated server or Heroku or something that can run software containers, if that thing goes away, you don't lose your data, right? Your data is, you're using a database host or kind of a data backend or whatever. So stuff you want to keep, that's running in a reliable service, or it's a set of static files with the reliable reliable storage. And I guess those are some of the questions I have, like even the question I had earlier about like what's your stack. I do have to try to remember to like check I'm a developer, and even though I've kind of been around a long time, I've kind of watched different people approach application development, software development in different ways. I'm actually still relatively new, and so I got to see a lot of the crack and painful stuff that people did, and so like the way I do apps, it's like I know how to build containers, so I write my software, it can run in the container, and I can deploy the application against any infrastructure that can run a container. And if I need to connect to a database, right, I can set up a database and I can give credentials, and so that application can integrate with that database. And if the app server goes away, I don't lose my data, and I can move it anywhere, anywhere anybody can run that type of infrastructure. And so yeah, I guess the challenge is we're not yet at the place. Like I definitely wouldn't say, well, go learn Docker or go learn containers or whatever.
Why is it stream leaking?
Yeah, I think I see what you're getting at, which is that there isn't yet an obvious sort of like standard for this stuff. But it's getting there. It's
right.
Like,
but providers like Heroku and Glitch, that's what they're using, right? That's what they're using to make it easier to operate your software. It's like they give you a recipe for setting the project up, and they can take that and generate some kind of bundle, right? Whether it's an actual container or it's just a zip file or a tar file, and they run it. But it kind of leads, like for me, like I said earlier, right? I've gotten to the point where, because I've been around enough, like I used to run ThinkUp, like a PHP app for doing social media analysis or whatever, and it got owned by some Eastern European hackers, Russian or Estonian, I don't know, whatever. And I was just like, and then I lost like 3 gigabytes of tweets because I followed thousands of people. I'm like, I lost like, so I'm just like, I still feel that pain. And so anytime somebody's like, oh, we'll just go and run this, and I'm like, no, like what's gonna happen? When this goes wrong, what do I do?
Right.
So I'm always just like, oh, how do I give me a system, give me a path to a system where when this stuff breaks, I can go take it somewhere else, or I can fix it. And so I guess when I think about like I want portability in terms of like my RSS feeds and my activity data and all of that though, but I also want portability for like my stack. Like does
I think that's important.
The community have playbooks or run books for operating? I mean, I see the tutorials for like setting stuff up though, but I mean, there's also maintenance, and it's like, are we sharing that? And is somebody figuring out ways to operationalize that and automate it or semi-automate it?
Yeah, I think we're trying, and I think we're also trying to give people the choice of like, pay someone to do it for you, or here's the instructions for doing it yourself, so that people can make that choice. Because not everyone wants to take the time to do it, or whatever. Or rather, you reach more people that way, right? So, yeah, I like that when this stuff breaks, I can take it somewhere else, or I can fix it. That's a good quote summary for like migration.
Speaking of summary of the session,
Are we done?
We have reached the end of this time.
Okay.
So,
I was going to ask if anyone's like actually transferred like large amounts of files between hosting services and experiences with that, as like a last question.
rsync.
But is rsync something that most hosting providers will give you? That's not like a,
If you have shell access, it'll definitely work, and if you have SFTP access that isn't shell, it will probably also work.
Our sync usually works like over SSH, so if you have SSH access, then usually you can run our sync. I think it requires to have some binaries installed both on the Boston as well as like on the other one. But as long as you have both installed and you have SSH access, you can use it.
yeah. When I looked at these hosting providers, like menus and options of what features, none of them list SSH access as a feature. So as long as you have SSH access is not actually a good answer. And so that's why I was asking this question about like shared hosting providers.
So DreamHost does allow SSH access to their shared hosts.
It does.
It does.
Interesting.
It might be phrased differently, something like shell access.
Yeah.
That's good to know.
They do kill long running processes though. I found that out running Composer sometimes to install stuff, and it's like, it's taking too long.
I recently migrated a couple podcasts, and then that's an area that I think is going to be a big problem for migration soon, because it turns out like
A lot of files.
really big. I mean, like even if your compose only like maybe 20 to 50 meg each, when you have it really adds up, and it was a difficult migration, and especially a lot of podcast hosts have no SSH access or SFTP access at all. So that's something as more people do podcasts, I hope we do something for. I don't know. I'm not sure how to make that easier, but it's a really big problem with the big files.
Yeah.
Many big files.
All right. I guess we're
I guess we're done.
I guess we're done.
Get us too far behind on the rest of the day. So.
Good. I think we've captured both like a bunch of the different options, plus a bunch of the challenges to keep in mind, too. So, all right. I'll let you all know how it goes with whatever I end up doing. Thanks.